It's kind of a truism that when you tell a lie, it can snowball into something far worse. I read a story about a man who was invited out by some coworkers to dinner, and his boss was going along, and he wasn't all that keen about going out to dinner with his boss. So he begged off, saying that he was supposed to go for dinner with his wife and her parents. When he got home, it turns out his wife actually did want to go out for dinner. And so he and his wife got in the car, drove to a restaurant, and just as they were getting out in the parking lot, they saw his coworkers. Busted. But in order not to get caught, he and his wife grabbed an elderly couple that was heading into the restaurant ahead of them and browbeat them into joining him for dinner. He recounted how they had absolutely nothing in common and that they sat and ate in silence, and it was the most awkward dinner he'd ever had. Now, of course, our deceptions can grow into something far worse than an awkward dining experience. And I think in the Bible, there's probably no better instance of this to display this idea than David and Bathsheba. So today, we're going to look at the first part of this story, 2 Samuel chapter 11. And let's just dive into the text here. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanness. Then, when she went back home, the woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." So there's a few things that I think the author of the text is trying to hammer home in this opening to set up the story. The first is, you'll notice in verse 1 that it says that at the time when the kings go off to war, David sent Joab. So it's setting this all up by saying that David is not being responsible to his duties. He should be out leading the people of Israel in war, and instead he's staying back and taking afternoon naps. Now, at a point in the story, David sees a beautiful woman bathing. Now, he probably has the highest roof in the city, and so when he's walking around on it, he can see pretty much anything he wants. And so it's not necessarily that he was doing anything wrong that he saw this woman, but then he should have averted his eyes and forgotten about what he saw. But instead, he allows himself to linger. Now, of course, kings in that culture were allowed to have many wives. It was something that the Bible said, that the law had said specifically that the kings should not do, but it was an accepted practice, and David had already taken several wives. And so it is possible that David saw this beautiful woman and decided that maybe he wanted to get her for his own wife. And so he sends out a person to find out about her. But the person comes back and says she's Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Well, even for a king, a married woman is off limits. And so at that point, this whole pursuit should have stopped dead. It probably should have stopped dead earlier, but at this point, David has no excuse to keep going. But he does. At this point, he crosses from lust into something far worse. He sends people to go and get her, and they bring her. And, well, the Bible doesn't really say anything about Bathsheba's willingness or not during what happens next. But in the age of the Me Too movement, we're probably pretty sensitive to the idea that the power imbalance between a king and a female subject is so great that there really isn't even the possibility of meaningful consent at that point. And so David crosses the line from lust into both adultery and rape. And so very quickly, David's little sin, or what seems like a little sin of lust, becomes something far, far worse because he doesn't deal with it in its early stages. Now, David probably thought that he could get away with this. He could send the woman home, and the people that he had in the palace would shut up about it, and no one would be the wiser. But then there's a monkey wrench in the plan. Of course, Bathsheba sends word that she's pregnant. At this point, David has a few options. The first is that he can cover up his wrongdoing. He can say, I've never seen that woman before in my life. Don't know who she is. If she fingers him, it's going to be her word against his, and he's the king and a man. He's probably going to be the one to be believed in that culture. And so he could do that. He could leave her to face the judgment herself. But she very well may be stoned to death for it, and she's carrying his child. So that's not a good option for him. The second option, and of course the best option, is that he could fess up to what he's done. In that culture, adultery and rape were capital crimes, but he's the king. And so if that were exposed, it's likely that it would simply be an embarrassment for him. But David, he has a reputation to uphold. He's the pious, godly king, and this would be a stain on his record. And so, unfortunately, David goes with a third option, an attempt to cover it up. And this, of course, makes things vastly worse. He invites Uriah the Hittite, the wife of Bathsheba, back from the front lines where he's in battle. And he tells him to come on in, give me some news about the front line, and then, while you're here, you might as well go home and wash your feet. And wash your feet in that culture is a euphemism for go home and relax, enjoy yourself, see your wife, and, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Uriah, when he leaves, sleeps outside the door of the palace. You'd do this to protect the king in case there was any sort of insurrection during the night. And so, the next day, David realizes that his plan isn't working out, and so he tries again. Only this time he gets Uriah good and drunk, hoping that that will weaken his resolve. But Uriah does the same thing. He sleeps on the king's porch, and he doesn't go home. When he's asked about it, he says that how on earth could he go home and enjoy the comforts that he'd have with his wife when the ark of the Lord is in a tent in the field of battle and his comrades are out risking their lives? David realizes at this point that his plan isn't going to work, and so he's forced to shift into plan B. Plan B, of course, is to have Uriah eliminated so that he can take Bathsheba as his own wife and legitimate the child. So we pick up in 2 Samuel 11, verses 14 to 17, in which it says, In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, Put Uriah at the front where the fighting is the fiercest. Then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down and die. So while Joab was in the city under siege, he put Uriah at the place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. So David sends Uriah with a letter to Joab, giving Joab instructions to kill Uriah. But it gets more complicated because in order to have Uriah knocked off, Joab has to do something militarily stupid. When you're besieging a city, you don't get your troops in too close because that puts them in unnecessary danger. And in order to bump off Uriah, Joab has to send in troops too close. And Uriah is killed, but others in the army are also killed. So in other words, there's collateral damage here beyond the innocent man that David wants to kill. There are other men who are immaterial to all of this who also end up dying. So we have David progressing from lust to adultery and rape, and then all the way to murdering multiple people. Now, most of us aren't kings, but we do make decisions in our life about whether or not we should behave in ways that we know are wrong. We sometimes rationalize those by saying that they're no big deal. Lust, no big deal. It's not hurting anybody. But what we see in the life of David is this lust quickly snowballed into something that would wreak destruction in David's life and in his family, and also in the family of other people throughout Israel, the soldiers who were killed needlessly to cover up David's sin. Oftentimes as Christians, we don't like it when we talk about sin. We deride people who do this as legalists. But of course, the problem is that we don't just talk about sin as an issue of salvation or damnation. Instead, we have to understand that sin dramatically affects our lives in the here and now. I'd say that likely many of the difficult things that we face in our lives are the result of sin, either ours or someone else's. We're being affected directly by someone's sin or indirectly by someone's sin. When we sin, we become part of the problem rather than the solution. We make God's world a little bit more like the kingdom of not heaven than the kingdom of heaven. But sin is also insidious. We can be convinced that my sin is trivial in comparison to everybody else's sin. We can be convinced that the sin that I do is no big deal. In the old Cold War period, the Soviets would find somebody who was upset or annoyed or who felt like they were hard done by, and they would give them a small ask. Can you steal some sensitive document for me? And the person would feel like, well, this isn't really a terrible thing to do, and so they would do it. But after they had done that, now they were compromised. And the spies could say, well, now you need to get us a real secret document. And if you don't, we're going to expose you as a spy. And now suddenly, in order to avoid exposure, a person was required to actually go further and further down the road of becoming a greater and greater traitor. And in the same way, we can engage in a little sin, but suddenly we become stuck in a pattern of deepening and deepening sin, especially when we're desperate to keep from being exposed for the sin that we've committed. So sin asks little things of us at first, and then asks greater and greater things, until we become like the proverbial frog, boiled alive but completely unaware that the process is happening. Sin will always take you further than you want to go, and will always cost you more than you want to pay. So how do we deal with sin? Well, the first thing is it's important to nip sin in the bud. The greatest tool that we have for this is confession. As Protestants and modern day Protestants, oftentimes we talk about confessing our sins to God. And we ought to confess our sins to God. But early Christians understood confession as something that Christians did for one another. And even in the early Reformation, the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers means that we are supposed to confess our sin to other Christians. And that any Christian, by virtue of their connection to Jesus, is ordained as a priest, meaning that they can offer absolution, forgiveness, the assurance of forgiveness of sin, to any other Christian. And so we really ought to be confessing our sins to one another. And in so doing, we become people who are known. It fractures the facades that we try to build up that make us look holier than everybody else. And it allows us to be known for who we truly are. It also keeps us accountable to each other when we have to confess our sins. And so when we think about life in a place where we're controlled by sin, the first step we need to take is to have somebody to whom we are accountable, to whom we must confess. And if you don't have somebody like that, you really need to find somebody who, when you confess your sin, you know that they're not going to reject you. You know that they'll offer you the assurance of God's forgiveness, but that they're not just going to soft pedal it and say, well, we all do it, it doesn't really matter. The second thing that we need to do is to invite God's scrutiny. In Psalm 139, David says this lovely thing, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me, and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." That's Psalm 139, 23 and 24. If only David was always that careful, and if only we were too.